A millionaire found a homeless girl holding a teddy bear, what she said left him crying. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Enjoy the story. It was a cold and drizzly evening in New York City, the kind of night when people hurried to their destinations, heads down and umbrellas held tightly against the wind. The streets were alive with movement, yet the atmosphere felt somber, weighed down by the steady patter of rain and the dull glow of streetlights reflecting off wet asphalt. Among the bustling crowd, Charles Bennett, a man whose name was synonymous with wealth and power, found himself stopping in his tracks. He wasn't a man who paused often. His days were dictated by schedules, meetings, and decisions that shaped industries. But tonight, something was different. As he adjusted his perfectly tailored coat and prepared to step into his waiting car, his eyes caught a small figure huddled in the shadows of a decrepit building. At first, he thought it was nothing, just another unfortunate soul lost to the relentless grind of the city. Yet, as he looked closer, he realized it was a child. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old, her small frame shivering under a threadbare coat. Her dark hair was plastered to her face by the rain, but it wasn't her soaked appearance that stopped Charles. It was the object in her arms. Clutched tightly against her chest was a tattered teddy bear, its fur worn and one of its button eyes missing. Something about that bear, the way she held it like a lifeline, sent a jolt through Charles. He approached slowly, his expensive shoes splashing through shallow puddles. The girl didn't notice him at first, her wide, sorrowful eyes fixed on the ground. When he stopped a few feet away, he cleared his throat. "Hey, kid," he said, his deep voice softened in an attempt not to startle her. "What are you doing out here alone?" The girl looked up, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her eyes, large brown and filled with a mixture of fear and innocence, met his. She hesitated for a moment, clutching the bear tighter, as if it could shield her from the questions of a stranger. Finally, she whispered, "I'm waiting." Charles frowned. Waiting for what? Or who? She glanced at the empty street, her small shoulders trembling. "My mommy. She said she'd come back for me." The simplicity of her words hit him like a blow. Charles had built his life around efficiency, around solving problems and making decisions that left little room for emotion. Yet, standing in the rain before this fragile child, he felt something he hadn't in years, an ache deep in his chest, one he couldn't quite name. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked gently. The girl shrugged, looking down at the bear. "A while. I'm not sure." Charles glanced around, his sharp eyes scanning the desolate street. There were no signs of anyone searching for a child. His mind raced with questions. Who would leave their child here? What kind of mother could do that? Yet, looking at the girl's face, he saw no anger or bitterness, only a quiet resilience that unsettled him. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching down to meet her eye level. "Emily," she said softly. Then, lifting the bear slightly, she added, "And this is Mr. Buttons." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Charles's mouth, despite the heaviness of the moment. "That's a good name for a bear," he said. "Does Mr. Buttons keep you company?" Emily nodded, her grip on the bear tightening. "He keeps me safe." Charles's gaze lingered on the bear, a sense of familiarity prickling at the back of his mind. There was something about it, its faded color, the stitching on its side, that tugged at memories he'd long buried. He shook the thought away, focusing instead on the girl before him. "Emily," he said carefully, "do you have anywhere to go? Anyone to take care of you?" She shook her head, her wet hair clinging to her face. "No. Mommy said stay here, so I'm waiting." Charles let out a slow breath, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. The rain was seeping through his coat now, but he barely noticed. He looked at Emily, truly looked at her, her too thin frame, her worn clothes, and the desperate hope in her eyes. "Emily," he said firmly, "you can't stay here." It's not safe. Her eyes widened with fear. But what if Mommy comes back and I'm not here? She won't know where to find me. Charles hesitated, unsure of how to reassure her. I'll make sure your mother knows where you are, he said finally. But for now, you need to be somewhere warm and safe. You can't stay in the rain like this. Emily looked at him uncertainly, her fingers clutching Mr. Buttons as if he could somehow guide her. Will Mr. Buttons be safe too? She asked, her voice barely audible. Charles's chest tightened at the simplicity of her question. Of course, he said softly. Both of you will be safe. For a moment, she didn't move, her wide eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Then, slowly, she reached out her small hand and placed it in his. The gesture was so small, yet it carried a weight that Charles couldn't ignore. As he led her toward his car, Emily glanced back at the darkened street, her face a mix of longing and uncertainty. Charles opened the door and helped her inside, the warmth of the car enveloping her small frame. She sank into the seat, her eyes darting nervously around the luxurious interior. Charles climbed in beside her, signaling to his driver to head home. As the car pulled away, he glanced at Emily through the rearview mirror. She was holding Mr. Buttons close, her wide eyes staring out the window. Charles leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. The image of the bear lingered in his thoughts, a ghost of a memory he couldn't quite place. But one thing was clear, meeting Emily wasn't a coincidence. It was the beginning of something that would change his life forever. The drive to Charles Bennett's penthouse was quiet, the hum of the car's engine the only sound cutting through the night. Emily sat in the back seat, her small frame dwarfed by the plush leather seats. She held Mr. Buttons tightly, her wide eyes darting nervously between the world passing by outside the window and Charles, who occasionally glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Are you hungry?" he asked after a long silence, his tone softer than usual. Emily hesitated, then gave a small nod. "A little," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Charles gestured to his driver. "Stop at next diner." The car slowed as they approached a quaint little diner, its neon sign flickering against the rainy night. Charles stepped out first, holding the door open for Emily. She followed cautiously, Mr. Buttons still clutched in her arms like a shield. Inside, the warmth of the diner wrapped around them, the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee filling the air. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of truck drivers nursing their cups of coffee. They took a booth near the back, the oversized leather seats almost swallowing Emily as she perched nervously on the edge. A waitress approached with a tired but kind smile, her pen poised over a notepad. "What can I get you folks?" Charles glanced at Emily. "What do you want to eat?" Emily looked down at the table, her fingers fidgeting with the edges of Mr. Buttons. Maybe a grilled cheese." The waitress nodded, her smile softening. "And for you?" she asked Charles. "Just coffee," he replied curtly. As the waitress walked away, Charles studied Emily. She was still soaking wet, her damp hair sticking to her face, but she seemed too preoccupied to notice. Her eyes darted around the diner, taking in every detail, as though she wasn't used to being in a place like this. "Emily," Charles began, leaning slightly forward. "How long have you been waiting out there?" She glanced at him, her grip on Mr. Buttons tightening. "A while," she said quietly. "I don't know how long." Charles frowned. "And your mother? Did she say where she was going?" Emily shook her head. "She just said to wait for her. She promised she'd come back." Her words stirred something deep within him, a pang of sadness, perhaps, or a flicker of a memory he couldn't quite grasp. He cleared his throat, trying to push the feeling aside. "Do you have any other family? Someone who could take care of you?" Emily's face fell, and she shook her head again. "It's just me and Mommy." Before Charles could respond, the waitress returned with a steaming plate of grilled cheese and a mug of coffee. Emily stared at the sandwich, her eyes wide, as though she hadn't seen a proper meal in days. "Go ahead," Charles urged gently. "Eat." Emily hesitated for a moment, then picked up the sandwich and took a tentative bite. The warm, gooey cheese seemed to melt away some of her tension, and she ate quickly, as though she feared it might disappear. Charles watched her in silence, his thoughts churning. The bear in her arms, Mr. Buttons, nagged at the back of his mind. There was something eerily familiar about it, something that stirred a memory he hadn't revisited in years. "Emily," he said after a while, his voice quieter, "that bear, where did you get it?" She looked up, her eyes wary. "Mommy gave it to me. She said it's special." "Special how?" Charles pressed, his curiosity piqued. Emily shrugged, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. "She said it was a gift from someone really nice. Someone who cared about her." Charles leaned back in his seat, his jaw tightening. The bear wasn't just familiar. It was identical to one he had given his daughter, Lily, years ago. The thought sent a jolt through him, and he struggled to keep his composure. But it couldn't be the same bear. "Does the bear have a name stitched on it?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease brewing inside him. Emily nodded. "Yeah, it does. Mommy said the name makes it extra special. Can I see it?" Charles asked, trying to sound casual. Emily hesitated, then turned the bear over, revealing the faint stitching on its back. She pointed to it, her small finger tracing the faded letters. Charles leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. The name was faint, but there was no mistaking it, Lily. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Charles stared at the name, his mind racing. This wasn't just a coincidence. That bear had belonged to his daughter, his Lily. The memories he had worked so hard to bury came rushing back. Her laughter, her tiny hands clutching that very bear, and the day she was taken from him. "Where did your mom get this bear?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily looked at him, her brow furrowing. "I don't know," she said, clutching Mr. Buttons protectively. "She just said it was really special." Charles leaned back, running a hand over his face. His usual composure was cracking, and he didn't like it. "Emily," he said gently, "I think I know where that bear came from." She tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "You do?" He nodded, his throat tight. "It belonged to someone I loved very much. Someone I lost." Emily's eyes softened, and for a moment, the weight of her own sorrow seemed to lift. "Mommy always says people we love never really go away. They stay with us in here." She pointed to her chest, her words carrying a wisdom far beyond her years. Charles swallowed hard, unable to speak for a moment. He reached for his coffee, taking a long sip to steady himself. "Your mom sounds like a smart woman," he said finally. Emily nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "She is. That's why I know she'll come back." Charles's heart ached at her certainty, but he couldn't bring himself to say what he was thinking. That her mother's absence, combined with the bear's presence, raised far more questions than answers. Questions he wasn't sure he was ready to face. As they left the diner and climbed back into the car, Charles glanced at Emily through the rearview mirror. She was curled up with Mr. Buttons, her small frame dwarfed by the luxurious seat. He couldn't shake the feeling that meeting her was no accident. There was a connection between them, one he was determined to uncover. For the first time in years, Charles felt something stir deep within him, a sense of purpose, of responsibility. As the car glided through the rain-soaked streets, he silently vowed to help Emily find the answers she deserved, even if it meant confronting his own buried past. The quiet hum of the city surrounded Charles Bennett's penthouse as the rain continued to drizzle outside. Inside, the warmth of the luxurious apartment contrasted sharply with the tension simmering within. Emily sat curled up on the edge of an oversized couch, her small hands clutching Mr. Buttons as though he were the only anchor in her uncertain world. The faint glow of a fireplace lit the room, casting soft shadows across the plush furniture and high ceilings. Charles stood near the expansive window, his silhouette outlined by the city lights beyond. In one hand, he held a glass of water, though he hadn't taken a sip. His gaze, however, was far from the city. It was fixed inward, swirling with thoughts he had buried long ago. The name stitched on that bear, Lily, had pulled him into memories he'd spent years trying to forget. "Mr. Bennet." Emily's soft voice broke the silence, pulling him back to the present. He turned to see her watching him, her wide eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and unease. "Yes, Emily," he said, his tones softer than usual. "Are you okay?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "You look sad." Charles hesitated, caught off guard by her perceptiveness. "I'm fine," he said, setting the glass down on a nearby table. "Just thinking." Emily nodded, but didn't press further. Instead, she looked down at Mr. Buttons, brushing a finger over his worn stitching. "You said you knew where this bear came from," she ventured cautiously. "What did you mean?" Charles walked over and sat down in the armchair across from her, leaning forward slightly. "That bear belonged to someone very important to me," he said carefully. "My daughter, Lily." Emily's eyes widened, her grip on the bear tightening. "Your daughter," she echoed. "What happened to her?" Charles let out a slow breath, his gaze momentarily dropping to the floor. "She passed away. A long time ago." Emily's face softened, and she hugged Mr. Buttons closer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "That must have been really hard." "It was," Charles admitted, his voice quieter than before. "Losing her changed everything for me. I stopped thinking about anything other than work. It was easier than dealing with the pain." Emily looked down at the bear, her small fingers tracing the stitching again. "How did it get to me?" she asked, her voice tinged with wonder. "Did my mommy know your daughter?" Charles shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. I donated a lot of Lily's things after she was gone. I thought it would help someone else, but I never imagined I'd see that bear again." The weight of his words hung between them, and for a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Maybe Mr. Buttons was meant to find you again," she said simply. Charles blinked, her words hitting him in a way he hadn't expected. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Could it really be more than coincidence? Was this small girl and her tattered bear somehow connected to his daughter in a way he couldn't yet understand? "Emily," he said after a long pause, "do you know where your mother got the bear? Did she ever tell you?" Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "She said it was a gift. Someone gave it to her when she needed help." "Did she ever tell you who?" Charles pressed gently. Emily shook her head. "She just said it came from someone kind. Someone who wanted to make sure we were okay." Charles felt a strange mix of emotions: hope, confusion, and a gnawing sense of unfinished business. He stood and walked over to his desk, opening a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small, framed photograph of Lily, her radiant smile frozen in time. In her tiny hands, she held Mr. Buttons, her joy practically leaping off the picture. He brought the photo back to the couch and handed it to Emily. "This is my Lily," he said softly. Emily stared at the photo, her small face lighting up with recognition. "That's him," she exclaimed, pointing to the bear in the picture. "That's Mr. Buttons." Charles nodded, his throat tightening. "It is." He was her favorite. She never went anywhere without him. Emily looked at the photo again, then up at Charles. "She looks happy," she said, her voice filled with quiet awe. "She was," Charles replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was the happiest little girl I've ever known." The room fell into a heavy silence again, the weight of the past pressing down on both of them. Charles sat back in his chair, his mind racing with questions he didn't yet have answers to. How had Mr. Buttons ended up with Sarah and Emily? And why did it feel like this small girl was somehow bringing him closer to the memory of his daughter? Finally, he broke the silence. "Emily," he said gently, "I need to find your mother. If she's the one who had this bear, then she might know something. Something important." Emily's face fell slightly. "Do you think she's okay?" she asked hesitantly. Charles hesitated. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also didn't want to scare her. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I promise I'll do everything I can to find her." Emily nodded, her small hands gripping Mr. Buttons tightly. "I just want her to come back," she said softly. "I miss her so much." Charles felt his heart ache at her words. He stood and walked over to her, crouching down so they were at eye level. "We'll find her," he said firmly. "You're not alone in this, Emily. I'm going to help you." Her eyes searched his face, as if looking for reassurance. Finally, she nodded, a small spark of hope returning to her expression. "Okay," she said quietly. Charles stood, his resolve hardening. For years, he had buried his emotions, focusing on his empire and shutting out anything that reminded him of what he had lost. But now, standing in the presence of this small, brave girl and her tattered bear, he felt a sense of purpose reignite within him. This wasn't just about finding Emily's mother. It was about uncovering the threads of the past, threads that might finally bring him the closure he hadn't realized he needed. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Charles Bennett's penthouse, casting a golden glow across the modern furnishings. Emily sat at the breakfast table, her legs swinging beneath the chair, nervously nibbling on a piece of toast. Across from her, Charles stared at his tablet, scrolling through an endless stream of emails and contacts. His coffee sat untouched, the tension in his furrowed brow betraying his thoughts. "Mr. Bennett," Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. "Are you still trying to find my mommy?" Charles looked up from his tablet, his expression softening as he met her hopeful gaze. "I am," he said, setting the device down. "But I need your help, Emily. Anything you can remember about where your mom might have gone could make a difference." Emily bit her lip, her small hands gripping Mr. Buttons tightly. "She always talked about working at a big house," she said hesitantly. "Like a mansion. She said she used to clean there." Charles leaned forward, his interest piqued. "A mansion," he repeated. "Did she ever tell you where it was or who lived there?" Emily shook her head, her expression thoughtful. "Not really. But she said the people there didn't like me. She had to leave me with a neighbor when she went to work." Charles frowned, his mind racing. A mansion narrowed the possibilities, but it was still a vague lead. He tapped his fingers against the table, formulating a plan. "Emily," he said gently, "do you remember anything else? Maybe the name of the family she worked for?" Emily hesitated, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall. "I think Aldridge," she said finally. "Mommy said that name once when she was talking to a friend." Charles's eyes narrowed slightly. Aldridge. The name rang a bell. Richard Aldridge was a prominent figure in the city, known for his wealth and his pretentious attitude. If Sarah had worked for him, it could explain why she ended up in such a difficult position. "I think I know where we can start," Charles said, standing. "Finish your breakfast. We're going to pay the Aldridges a visit." The Aldridge estate was nothing short of opulent. Set behind tall iron gates, the sprawling mansion was surrounded by manicured gardens and a driveway that curved around a massive fountain. Emily stared at the grandeur in awe as Charles parked the car, his expression unreadable. "This is where Mommy worked?" Emily asked, clutching Mr. Buttons tightly. "It looks like it," Charles replied, stepping out of the car. He opened the door for Emily, helping her down. "Stay close to me." They approached the front door, where Charles rang the bell firmly. Moments later, a woman in a maid's uniform opened the door, her wary eyes flicking between Charles and Emily. "May I help you?" she asked cautiously. "We're here to speak with Mr. Aldridge," Charles said, his tone firm but polite. The maid hesitated, her gaze lingering on Emily. "Does he know you're coming?" "No," Charles replied, his voice sharpening. "But I doubt he'll want me standing on his doorstep for long." Reluctantly, the maid stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. The interior of the mansion was just as extravagant as the exterior, with marble floors, towering ceilings, and chandeliers that sparkled in the sunlight streaming through massive windows. As they waited in the grand foyer, Emily tugged on Charles's sleeve. "Do you think he knows where Mommy is?" she whispered. "I don't know," Charles admitted, glancing around the room. "But we're going to find out." Footsteps echoed from the staircase, and moments later, Richard Aldridge appeared. He was a tall man in his late 50s, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. His sharp features and calculating eyes gave him an air of authority, though there was something cold about his demeanor. "Mr. Bennet," Richard said, descending the last step. "I wasn't expecting you. What brings you to my home unannounced?" Charles stepped forward, his posture confident. "I'm looking for information about a former employee of yours," he said. "Sarah Taylor. She worked here as a housekeeper." Richard's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Sarah," he said slowly. "Yes, I remember her." Emily's face lit up with hope. "Do you know where she is?" she asked, stepping out from behind Charles. Richard glanced down at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm afraid not," he said. "She hasn't worked here in some time." Charles's jaw tightened. "Why did she stop working here?" Richard hesitated, his gaze shifting briefly to the maid, who stood silently nearby. "There were issues," he said vaguely. "We had to let her go." "What kind of issues?" Charles pressed, his voice laced with suspicion. Richard's composure faltered slightly. "She was caught stealing," he said. "Jewelry went missing, and we found it in her possession." "That's not true," Emily exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion. "My mommy would never steal." Richard's face darkened. "I'm sorry, but the evidence was clear." Charles took a step closer, his piercing gaze locking onto Richard's. "Or perhaps it was just convenient to accuse her," he said coldly. "What really happened, Aldridge?" Before Richard could respond, the maid shifted uncomfortably. Charles turned to her, his tone softening but still firm. "You know something, don't you?" he asked. "Tell me the truth." The maid glanced nervously at Richard, who glared at her with a warning look. But under Charles's unrelenting gaze, her resolve broke. "She didn't steal anything," the maid said quietly, her voice trembling. "She was set up." Emily's eyes widened, tears filling them. "Why would someone do that to her?" she asked, her voice breaking. The maid hesitated, then whispered, "The family didn't want her here anymore. Mrs. Aldridge thought she was too bold, too opinionated. They used the missing jewelry as an excuse to get rid of her." Charles turned back to Richard, his expression icy. "You ruined a woman's life because she didn't fit into your idea of a perfect servant. Do you even care what happened to her after she left here?" Richard bristled, but he said nothing. Charles took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "If you have any information about where she might have gone, now is the time to share it." After a long pause, Richard finally relented. "She mentioned staying with a relative in Queens before she left," he said grudgingly. "That's all I know." Charles nodded curtly. "If I find out you're lying, you'll regret it." He turned to Emily, his expression softening as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's go," he said gently. As they walked back to the car, Emily looked up at Charles, her eyes brimming with tears. "Do you think we'll find her now?" she asked. Charles knelt down, meeting her gaze. "We're one step closer," he said firmly. "I promised you we'd find her, and I don't break my promises." Despite the tension of the encounter, Charles felt a spark of hope. The trail was faint, but it was there, and he was determined to follow it, no matter what it took. The drive to Queens was filled with silence, the city blurring past as Charles's mind raced. Beside him, Emily clutched Mr. Buttons, her small face pressed against the car window as she stared at the passing scenery. Charles stole a glance at her, his resolve hardening. Every piece of the puzzle was leading them closer to Sarah, but the pieces themselves were heavy, tainted with injustice and unanswered questions. They arrived at a modest brick building in a quiet neighborhood. It was a stark contrast to the opulence of the Aldridge estate, its chipped paint and weathered steps speaking to the lives of those who lived within. Charles stepped out first, helping Emily down as her small hand gripped as tightly. Together, they walked up to the door marked 2B, the address Aldridge had begrudgingly provided. Charles knocked firmly, his knuckles rapping against the worn wood. The sound echoed faintly down the hallway. For a moment, there was no response. Then, footsteps approached, hesitant and measured. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 40s. Her face was lined with weariness, her dark eyes studying them cautiously. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Are you Gloria?" Charles asked, his tone calm but direct. The woman nodded slowly. "Who's asking?" Charles gestured toward Emily, who was partially hidden behind his leg. "I'm Charles Bennett, and this is Emily. We're looking for her mother, Sarah. We were told she stayed here for a while." Gloria's expression shifted, her eyes widening as they landed on Emily. Her hand flew to her mouth in surprise. "Oh, my lord," she whispered. "You're her little girl." Emily stepped forward, her wide eyes brimming with hope. "Do you know my mommy? Is she here?" Gloria knelt down, her gaze softening as she took in the sight of the girl clutching her tattered bear. "Yes, sweetheart," she said gently. "Your mommy stayed with me for a while. She loved you so much." Emily's voice trembled. "Where is she? Can I see her?" Gloria's face fell, the warmth in her eyes giving way to sorrow. She stood slowly, crossing her arms as though shielding herself from the weight of the question. "She left a few months ago," Gloria admitted. "She was trying to find work, but things didn't go the way she hoped." Charles stepped in, his voice steady but firm. "What do you mean? Where did she go?" Gloria hesitated, glancing at Emily before answering. "She found a job at a factory upstate. It wasn't much, but she said it was her last chance to make enough money to get back on her feet. Do you have an address?" Charles pressed, sensing that Gloria wasn't telling the full story. Gloria sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I do. She wrote to me when she first started working there. She disappeared into the apartment, returning moments later with a worn envelope. Here," she said, handing it to Charles. "This has the name and address of the factory." Charles took the envelope, scanning the handwritten note inside. The address led to a factory in a small town called Greenridge. "Thank you," he said, tucking the letter into his coat pocket. Emily tugged on Gloria's sleeve. "Why did she leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gloria knelt again, her expression pained. "She wanted to come back to you, sweetie. She said it was the only way she could make enough money to take care of you." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. She promised she'd come back. Gloria placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She wanted to, Emily. I know she did." Charles cleared his throat, his voice softening as he addressed Gloria. "Do you know why she hasn't returned? Did she say anything about her health or the conditions at the factory?" Gloria hesitated, then shook her head. "She didn't tell me much, but she didn't look well when she left. She was thin, tired. I tried to get her to stay, but she wouldn't listen. She was so determined." Charles nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll find her." As they turned to leave, Gloria reached out and gently touched Emily's arm. "Take care of yourself, sweetheart," she said softly. "And don't forget how much your mommy loves you." Emily nodded, clutching Mr. Buttons even tighter. "I won't." The drive to Greenridge felt like an eternity. The scenery changed from city streets to rolling hills and quiet countryside, the hustle and bustle of New York fading into the background. Emily sat quietly in the back seat, her eyes fixed on the window, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Are you okay?" Charles asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She nodded, but her voice was small when she answered. "Do you think Mommy's okay?" Charles hesitated, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I hope so," he said finally. "But no matter what, we'll find her." When they arrived, the factory loomed in the distance, its gray exterior stark against the overcast sky. It was a sprawling building surrounded by rows of modest homes, the kind of place where hard work was the currency of survival. Charles parked the car and led Emily to the main entrance, where a security guard stood watch. "Can I help you?" the guard asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We're looking for Sarah Taylor," Charles said, holding up the envelope with the factory's address. "She worked here recently." The guard frowned, scratching the back of his head. "Sarah? Yeah, I remember her. Nice lady. Quiet. But she didn't stay long. Do you know where she went?" Emily asked, stepping forward with wide, hopeful eyes. The guard's expression softened as he looked at her. "She said she wasn't feeling well. Talked about finding a shelter in the next town over. Maplewood, I think." Charles nodded. "Thank you," he said. "That's helpful." The guard hesitated, then added, "She didn't look great when she left. I think she was trying to push through, but you could tell something was wrong." Emily's face fell, and Charles placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're getting closer," he said gently. One step at a time. Back in the car, the mood was somber. Emily sat in silence, her small hand resting on Mr. Button's as she stared out the window. Charles glanced at her, his heart heavy. Every step brought them closer to Sarah, but it also brought new questions and a growing unease. As they drove toward Maplewood, Charles silently vowed that no matter what they found, he wouldn't let Emily face it alone. The drive to Maplewood was quiet, the hum of the car engine the only sound cutting through the silence. Emily sat in the back seat, her gaze fixed on the world beyond the window. She clutched Mr. Buttons tightly, the tattered bear resting on her lap like a silent guardian. Charles glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable, but his mind racing. The closer they got, the heavier the weight of uncertainty pressed on them both. "Are we almost there?" Emily asked softly, breaking the silence. Charles nodded. "Not much farther now," he said, his voice calm despite the unease settling in his chest. Maplewood came into view like a quiet haven, a stark contrast to the bustling city they had left behind. The streets were lined with modest homes and small businesses, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Charles followed the directions they had received at the factory, eventually pulling up to a simple but well-maintained building with a sign out front, Maplewood Women's Shelter. Emily stared at the building, her small hands fidgeting nervously with Mr. Buttons. "Do you think Mommy is here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles turned to her, his expression softening. "I don't know, Emily," he said gently. "But if she's not, we'll keep looking. I promise." With that, they stepped out of the car and approached the entrance. Inside, the shelter was warm and welcoming, the scent of coffee lingering in the air. A woman behind the reception desk looked up as they entered, her kind eyes scanning the pair. "Good afternoon," she said with a polite smile. "How can I help you?" Charles stepped forward, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "We're looking for someone, Sarah Taylor. She's Emily's mother. We were told she might have stayed here recently." The receptionist's expression softened as she glanced at Emily, her eyes lingering on the tattered bear in her arms. "Sarah Taylor," she repeated, her tone thoughtful. "Yes, I remember her. She stayed here for a while." Emily's face lit up with hope. "Is she here now?" she asked, stepping closer to the desk. The receptionist hesitated, her smile fading slightly. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she said gently. "Your mom left the shelter several weeks ago. She wasn't feeling well and said she needed to see a doctor. She mentioned going to a hospital." Emily's expression crumbled, tears welling in her eyes. "But she promised she'd come back," she said, her voice trembling. The receptionist came around the desk, kneeling in front of Emily. "Your mommy loves you very much," she said softly. "She talked about you all the time. She was trying to get better so she could take care of you." Charles placed a steady hand on Emily's shoulder, his heart aching at the sight of her tears. "Do you know which hospital she went to?" he asked the receptionist. The woman nodded, standing and returning to the desk. She opened a file, flipping through pages before pulling out a discharge note. "She mentioned St. Mary's Hospital," she said, handing the paper to Charles. "It's just a few miles from here." Charles studied the paper, the name of the hospital written clearly across the top. He nodded, tucking it into his coat pocket. "Thank you," he said. "This helps more than you know." Before they left, the receptionist reached under the desk and pulled out a small bag. "She left this behind," she said, handing it to Emily. "I thought she might come back for it, but maybe it'll mean something to you." Emily took the bag with trembling hands, opening it to reveal a few personal items: a notebook, a small stack of papers, and a photograph of Emily herself, smiling brightly. Emily's breath hitched as she held up the photo. "She kept this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She kept it close," the receptionist said softly. "She loved you more than anything." Charles glanced at the notebook and papers, flipping through them quickly. One page caught his attention, a handwritten note in Sarah's familiar handwriting. It was brief but clear. "Going to St. Mary's. We'll try to get better. For Emily." He closed the notebook, his resolve hardening. "We're heading to St. Mary's," he said firmly, taking Emily's hand. "Let's go." The drive to St. Mary's Hospital was tense, the quiet hum of the engine doing little to ease the growing tension in the car. Emily clung to the bag from the shelter, her small hands trembling as she stared at the photograph. "Do you think she's okay?" she asked quietly, not looking up. Charles glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his throat tightening. "I hope so," he said honestly. "But whatever happens, you're not alone. I'll be right here." The hospital came into view as they turned the corner, its white facade standing stark against the overcast sky. Charles parked the car and helped Emily out, her small hand gripping his tightly. Together, they walked into the lobby, the sterile smell of disinfectant greeting them as they approached the front desk. A nurse looked up from her computer, her expression polite but professional. "Can I help you?" Charles stepped forward, his voice steady. "We're looking for Sarah Taylor. She was admitted here recently. Do you have any records of her?" The nurse typed into her computer, her brow furrowing as she scanned the screen. After a moment, she looked up, her eyes softening. "Sarah Taylor is here," she confirmed. "Room 214. Emily's face lit up with hope, but the nurse quickly added, "She's been very ill. Please prepare yourselves. She might not look the way you remember." Charles knelt beside Emily, his voice gentle but serious. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. Emily nodded, clutching Mr. Buttons tightly. "I just want to see her." The nurse led them down a long, quiet hallway. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When they reached room 214, Charles hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. He glanced at Emily, who gave him a small, determined nod. Taking a deep breath, Charles pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the steady beep of a heart monitor the only sound. On the bed lay Sarah, her frail body barely recognizable. Her once vibrant face was pale, her eyes closed, but the sound of the door creaking open made her eyelids flutter. "Mommy!" Emily cried, rushing to her side. Sarah's eyes opened, and for a moment, confusion flickered in them before recognition dawned. "Emily," she whispered, her voice weak, but filled with love. "My baby." Emily climbed onto the bed, wrapping her small arms around her mother. "I missed you so much," she sobbed. "I thought I'd never see you again." Charles stood silently at the door, his chest tightening at the sight of their reunion. The weight of everything they had endured to reach this moment felt both crushing and redemptive. Sarah looked up at him, her gaze soft but questioning. "Who are you?" she asked faintly. Charles stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Charles Bennett. I found Emily and brought her here. She's been waiting for you." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she looked back at her daughter. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for bringing her back to me." Charles simply nodded, his throat too tight to speak. For the first time in years, he felt something shift within him, a sense of purpose, of connection. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they wouldn't face them alone. The soft morning light filtered into the hospital room, casting a warm glow on Sarah's frail form as she lay against the stark white sheets. Emily had fallen asleep beside her mother, her small hand still clutching Sarah's weak fingers. Charles stood by the window, his arms crossed as he stared out at the city skyline. The weight of everything they had uncovered pressed heavily on him. Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she turned her head to see Emily. A faint smile played on her lips, though it was tinged with exhaustion. Her free hand moved to stroke Emily's hair gently. The touch woke the little girl, who blinked sleepily before realizing her mother was awake. "Mommy," Emily exclaimed, sitting up quickly, her face lit up with relief and joy. "You're awake." Sarah's voice was soft and raspy. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered. "I've missed you so much." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she hugged her mother carefully, afraid of hurting her. I thought I'd never see you again," she said, her voice trembling. Sarah's arms wrapped weakly around her daughter. "I promised I'd come back for you," she said. "I'm sorry it took so long." Charles turned from the window, his expression softening as he watched the emotional reunion. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he should interrupt. But Sarah's eyes shifted to him, and her smile faded slightly, replaced by curiosity. "You're the one who brought her here," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude, but also confusion. "Who are you?" Charles stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "My name is Charles Bennett. I found Emily on the streets, waiting for you. She's been incredibly brave." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again as she looked back at her daughter. "You were waiting for me all that time?" she asked, her heart breaking at the thought. Emily nodded, clutching Mr. Buttons. "You said you'd come back, so I waited," she said simply. "But then Mr. Bennett found me and helped me find you." Sarah's gaze returned to Charles, and her lips trembled. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You gave me my daughter back." Charles shook his head, his voice steady. "There's no need to thank me," he said. "But I need to ask you something, Sarah." She looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Emily's teddy bear, Mr. Buttons. That bear belonged to my daughter, Lily. She passed away years ago, but I recognized it immediately. How did you come to have it?" Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, and she glanced at Mr. Buttons, still clutched in Emily's arms. Her expression softened, and she let out a slow breath. "I never knew where it came from," she admitted. "A kind woman gave it to me years ago, when I was at my lowest point. She said it was a gift from someone who wanted to help." "A woman?" Charles asked, his curiosity deepening. "Do you remember her name?" Sarah shook her head. "No, but she was kind. She said the bear was special and that it might bring comfort to me and Emily. At the time, I didn't ask questions. I was just grateful for the kindness." Charles leaned back slightly, his thoughts racing. The idea that something so deeply connected to his past had made its way to Sarah and Emily seemed almost impossible. Yet here it was, sitting in Emily's lap as a tangible link between them. "Do you think it's a coincidence?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with wonder. "That the bear brought us together?" Charles hesitated before answering. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but it feels like something more." The room fell into a brief silence, the weight of their shared experiences settling over them. Finally, Sarah broke it. "Charles," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He nodded, his expression encouraging. "Go ahead." She glanced at Emily, who was now resting her head against her mother's shoulder, her eyes half closed. "When I left Emily, it wasn't because I wanted to," Sarah began, her voice trembling. "I was desperate. The Aldridges accused me of something I didn't do, and no one would hire me after that. I thought I could find work and make enough to get us back on our feet. But—" She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I didn't realize how sick I was. I kept pushing myself, thinking I could handle it, but my body gave out before I could get back to her." Charles's jaw tightened as he listened, his anger toward the Aldridges rekindling. "They ruined your life over a lie," he said, his voice cold. "And they didn't care about the consequences." Sarah nodded, her expression filled with pain. "I wanted to fight back, but I didn't have the resources. All I could think about was keeping Emily safe." Charles placed a hand on the back of the chair, his grip firm. "You shouldn't have had to go through that alone," he said. "And Emily shouldn't have been left to wait for you on the streets." Sarah's tears spilled over as she looked at him. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, "but I failed her." "No," Charles said firmly. "You didn't fail her. You did everything you could with what you had. And now, we'll make sure you both have what you need." Sarah stared at him, her gratitude clear in her eyes. "Why are you doing this for us?" she asked. "You don't even know us." Charles hesitated, then spoke with quiet conviction. "Because I've lost someone I loved, too. And I know what it feels like to want to fix something you can't. Helping you and Emily, it feels like the right thing to do." Sarah nodded, her lips trembling with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on her." Charles glanced at Emily, who had fallen asleep against her mother. "She's a special little girl," he said softly. "She reminds me of someone I used to know." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, Charles felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt they were moving towards something better. Whatever had brought Mr. Buttons back into his life, whether fate or coincidence, had also brought him a chance to heal. And for that, he was profoundly grateful. The soft glow of morning filled Sarah's hospital room, casting a warm light on the quiet reunion taking place. Emily was still curled up beside her mother, her head resting gently on Sarah's frail shoulder. Mr. Buttons was tucked between them, a small but powerful symbol of everything they had endured to find each other. Charles stood near the window, his gaze distant as he processed the weight of the journey they had all taken. Sarah's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "Charles," she began, her tone filled with gratitude and a hint of wonder, "you didn't have to do any of this. Why did you help us?" Charles turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. For a moment, he struggled to find the right words. "Because I saw something in Emily that reminded me of my daughter," he said finally. "When I found her, sitting there in the rain, clutching that bear, I couldn't just walk away. I've spent so many years avoiding the pain of my own loss. Helping her felt like a chance to do something right." Sarah's eyes softened as she looked at him. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you," she said. "You've given me back my daughter. You've given me a chance to fight for her." Charles shook his head, his voice firm but kind. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "The only thing that matters now is that you and Emily are together." Emily stirred at the sound of their voices, blinking sleepily as she sat up. "Are we staying here, Mommy?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Sarah smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Just for a little while," she said, "until I'm strong enough to leave." Charles stepped closer, his presence calm and reassuring. "You don't need to worry about anything, Sarah," he said. "I'll make sure you get the care you need. And when you're ready, we'll figure out the next steps together." Emily's eyes brightened as she looked between Charles and her mother. "Does that mean we'll all stay together?" she asked hopefully. Sarah's expression softened, and she glanced at Charles, who gave her a small nod. "For now, yes," Sarah said, her voice steady. "We'll stay together." Later that day, a doctor entered the room, his clipboard in hand and a kind smile on his face. "Mrs. Taylor," he began, addressing Sarah, "I've reviewed your test results. While your condition is serious, I believe with the right treatment and time to recover, you can make a full recovery." Sarah let out a shaky breath, relief flooding her features. "Thank you, doctor," she said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes." The doctor glanced at Charles, who was standing nearby. "I understand you've offered to cover her medical expenses, Mr. Bennett," he said. "I assure you, we'll provide the best care possible." Charles nodded, his voice calm but resolute. "Money isn't an issue. Just make sure she gets what she needs." After the doctor left, Sarah turned to Charles, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she said, her voice trembling. "You've already done so much." Charles waved a hand dismissively, his expression softening. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Just focus on getting better. That's all that matters." The days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Sarah grew stronger. Emily rarely left her side, her cheerful chatter filling the room and lifting Sarah's spirits. Charles visited daily, often bringing small gifts for Emily, a book, a puzzle, or her favorite snacks. At first, Sarah resisted the help, her pride struggling against the kindness she wasn't used to. But over time, she began to see Charles not as a benefactor, but as a friend. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the city, Sarah turned to Charles, who was sitting in a chair near the window. Emily was asleep in her bed, her small hand resting protectively on Mr. Button's. "You've given us more than I ever thought possible," Sarah said quietly. "But I have to ask, what happens when I leave here? How do I build a life for Emily after everything we've been through?" Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "I meant it when I said I'd help you figure out the next steps. Whether that's finding a place for you to stay, helping you get back on your feet, or just being someone you can rely on, I'm here." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "You've given us more than just a second chance," she said. "You've given us hope." The day Sarah was discharged from the hospital was a quiet but joyful milestone. Charles had arranged for a small apartment nearby where Sarah and Emily could stay while she continued her recovery. Emily's face lit up with excitement as they walked through the cozy space, her small hands exploring every corner. "Mommy, look," she exclaimed, pointing to a small bookshelf filled with children's books. "It's perfect." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling at the sight of her daughter's happiness. She turned to Charles, her expression filled with emotion. "You've thought of everything," she said. "I don't know how to repay you." Charles smiled faintly. "Seeing Emily smile is thanks enough," he said. "You two deserve this." As the weeks turned into months, their lives began to settle into a new rhythm. Sarah found part-time work as she regained her strength, and Emily started attending a local school, her laughter filling the once-empty apartment. Charles remained a steady presence in their lives, visiting often and ensuring they had everything they needed. One evening, as they sat around a small dinner table, Emily looked up at Charles with a shy smile. "Mr. Bennet," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Charles replied, setting down his fork. "Do you think Lily would be happy that you helped us?" she asked, her voice earnest. Charles felt a lump rise in his throat, but he managed to smile. "I think she would be very happy," he said. "And I think she'd be proud of you, Emily." Emily beamed, clutching Mr. Buttons tightly. "I'm glad Mr. Buttons brought us together," she said. Charles's heart swelled at her words. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet but powerful feeling that his loss had paved the way for something new and meaningful. Whatever the future held, he knew they would face it together. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.